A black nurse named Jessica helps an injured homeless man named Tom. But moments later, when she discovers who he really is, she screams in terror. What shocking revelation could flip her world upside down and leave her life changed forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jessica's shoulders slumped as she pushed open the heavy hospital doors. The cool, evening air hit her face, a stark contrast to the stuffy corridors she'd left behind. Her feet ached, and her mind felt fuzzy after a grueling 12-hour shift in the emergency room. All she wanted was to get home, kick off her shoes, and sink into her couch with a cup of hot tea. As she fumbled for her car keys, a faint groan caught her attention. Jessica's eyes darted to the side of the building, where a crumpled figure lay on the ground. Her heart clenched at the sight of the frail man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his face etched with pain. For a split second, Jessica hesitated. She was so tired, and surely someone else would help him soon. But her conscience tugged at her, reminding her of the oath she'd taken as a nurse. With a deep sigh, she hurried over to the man's side. "Sir, can you hear me?" Jessica knelt beside him, her fatigue forgotten as her training kicked in. The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing bloodshot whites and confusion. "Water," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica's practiced gaze took in his chapped lips and the way his skin seemed to hang loosely on his frame. Dehydration, she thought. And as her eyes traveled down his body, she noticed a nasty gash on his leg, poorly bandaged with a dirty rag. "It's okay, I'm here to help," Jessica soothed, her voice gentle. She dug through her bag, fishing out a water bottle she'd meant to drink on her drive home. "Here, small sips." As she helped the man drink, Jessica's mind raced. She knew she should call for help, get him admitted properly. But something in the man's frightened eyes made her pause. He looked so vulnerable, so lost. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Tom," he mumbled, his gaze darting around nervously. "Tom, I'm Jessica. I'm a nurse here at the hospital. Will you let me take care of that leg for you?" Tom hesitated, then gave a small nod. Jessica's heart swelled with compassion. She might be exhausted, but she knew she couldn't leave this man alone in suffering. With gentle hands and soothing words, she began to clean and dress his wound, all thoughts of her own comfort forgotten in the face of someone else's need. Jessica carefully cleaned Tom's wound, her gentle touch a stark contrast to the harsh world he'd been living in. With practiced efficiency, she applied a fresh bandage, all the while keeping a watchful eye on his overall condition. "Tom, we need to get you inside," she said softly. "You need more care than I can give you out here." Tom's eyes widened with fear. No hospital can't afford it. Jessica's heart ached at his words. "Don't worry about that now. What's important is getting you healthy." With a tenderness that belied her exhaustion, Jessica helped Tom to his feet. He leaned heavily on her as they made their way through the hospital doors, his frail body trembling with each step. "I need some help over here," Jessica called out as they entered the emergency room. Her colleagues sprang into action, quickly bringing a wheelchair for Tom. As they transferred him, Jessica briefed the staff on his condition. Severe dehydration, possible infection in a leg wound. He needs fluids and antibiotics stat. As her coworkers wheeled Tom away, Jessica found herself following, unable to leave his side. She watched as they hooked him up to an IV, her trained eyes scanning the monitors for any signs of distress. Throughout the flurry of activity, Jessica stayed close, offering words of comfort to Tom whenever he looked overwhelmed. There was something about this man that tugged at her heartstrings, a familiarity she couldn't quite place. As things settled down and Tom drifted into a much-needed sleep, Jessica pulled up a chair beside his bed. She knew her shift had ended hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Her mind kept circling back to the lost look in Tom's eyes, the way he'd flinched at kindness as if it were foreign to him. Jessica leaned back in her chair, her own exhaustion finally catching up with her. Yet even as her eyelids grew heavy, She found herself studying Tom's weathered face, trying to understand the strange connection she felt. The next day, as the bustling activity of the emergency room settled, Jessica found herself drawn back to her regular duties. She moved through the hospital corridors, checking on patients and updating charts, but her mind kept drifting to the homeless man she'd helped earlier. The image of his weathered face and frightened eyes lingered in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about him, something that tugged at her heart in a way she couldn't explain. Throughout her shift, Jessica found herself glancing at the clock more often than usual. She was eager to finish her rounds and check on the mysterious patient who had so captured her attention. Finally, as the hands of the clock aligned to signal the end of her shift, Jessica breathed a sigh of relief. She quickly tidied up her workstation and made her way to the recovery ward where the homeless man had been admitted. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as she approached his room. Jessica paused at the door, taking a deep breath to calm her inexplicably racing heart. She knocked softly before entering. The man lay still in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the crisp white sheets. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, a reassuring rhythm that told Jessica he was stable. She approached the bed quietly, not wanting to disturb his rest. His face looked more peaceful now, the lines of worry and pain somewhat smoothed by sleep and proper care. Jessica found herself studying his features, trying to place why he seemed so familiar. Jessica stood by the homeless man's bedside, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. She couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this stranger, a pull she couldn't explain. Carefully, she adjusted the blankets covering him, making sure he was comfortable. As she smoothed the fabric over his arm, something caught her eye. A faded mark peeked out from beneath the hospital gown. Curious, Jessica gently lifted the sleeve to get a better look. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the tattoo in its entirety. It was a simple design, a small anchor with a rope twisted around it. But it wasn't the design that made her heart race. It was the familiarity of it. Jessica stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her mind reeled as memories flooded back. Memories of a similar tattoo on another arm, an arm that had once held her close, that had pushed her on swings, that had waved goodbye for the last time. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice trembling. But there was no denying it. The tattoo was identical to the one her father had worn proudly on his forearm. The same father who had walked out of her life years ago, leaving behind a void that had never quite been filled. Panic gripped Jessica's chest, making it hard to breathe. She stared at the unconscious man, really looking at him for the first time. The lines on his face, the shape of his nose, the set of his jaw. How had she not seen it before? Beneath the years of hardship and neglect, she could now see traces of the man she once called Dad. Confusion swirled in her mind, mixing with a cocktail of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle. Anger, hurt, longing, and a tiny spark of hope all battled for dominance. Jessica's legs felt weak and she sank into the chair beside the bed. Her eyes never left the man's face, searching for more signs, more proof that this was really happening. "Dad?" she whispered, the word feeling strange on her tongue after so many years. "Is it really you?" Jessica's mind raced as she stared at the unconscious man before her. Her hands trembled and she clenched them into fists, trying to regain control. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to echo her own racing pulse. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice quivering with anger. "How dare you show up like this after all these years?" Memories flooded back, birthdays spent waiting for a call that never came, graduations with an empty seat in the audience, and countless nights spent wondering why she wasn't good enough for him to stay. The pain of abandonment which she had buried deep inside now bubbled to the surface. But as quickly as the anger came, it was replaced by a wave of concern. The man lying in the hospital bed looked so frail, so vulnerable. His weathered face told a story of hardship and struggle. Despite her fury, Jessica couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him in all those years. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Focus, Jess," she muttered. "You're a nurse first." With shaking hands, she reached for his chart, forcing herself to look at him as just another patient. She checked his vitals, making sure everything was stable, but every time her eyes fell on his face, her heart clenched. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "How am I supposed to feel?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She was at work, she reminded herself. She needed to be professional. But the weight of the situation threatened to crush her. Jessica sank back into the chair, her emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to run from the room and never look back. Another part wanted to wake him up and demand answers for all the years of pain and confusion. And yet another part, a part she was almost ashamed to admit, wanted to hold his hand and tell him everything would be okay. She looked at the man, her father, and felt her heart breaking all over again. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you leave us? Why are you here now?" Jessica sat in the chair beside Tom's hospital bed, her mind drifting back to a sunny afternoon 20 years ago. She was just 7 years old, her pigtails bouncing as she skipped home from school. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the warmth of the sun on her face. "Daddy!" she had called out as she burst through the front door. "Daddy, I got an A on my spelling test!" But the house was eerily quiet. No response came. Jessica's small feet carried her from room to room, searching for her father. "Daddy?" she called again, her voice growing smaller with each unanswered plea. She found her mother in the kitchen, shoulders slumped, clutching a piece of paper. Lydia's eyes were red and puffy, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy?" Jessica had whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "Where's Daddy?" Lydia had looked up, her face crumpling as she tried to explain to her little girl that Daddy was gone. He had left them, with nothing but a hastily scribbled note saying he couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. The memory shifted to the weeks and months that followed. Jessica remembered crying herself to sleep night after night, wondering why her daddy didn't love her enough to stay. She recalled the struggle in her mother's eyes as Lydia worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Birthdays came and went without a card or a call. Christmases passed with an empty chair at the dinner table. Each milestone in Jessica's life was tinged with the bittersweet ache of her father's absence. As the memories washed over her, Jessica felt the old pain rising in her chest. The little girl inside her still yearned for her daddy's love, but the woman she had become felt a hardness settling over her heart. Years of hurt and abandonment had left their mark. She looked at the frail man in the hospital bed, barely recognizing him as the strong, vibrant father of her childhood. Anger bubbled up inside her, mixing with the pain and confusion. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room as Jessica sat by the man's bedside, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes never left his face, searching for any sign of recognition. As if on cue, the man's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. "Sir?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you hear me?" The man's gaze drifted around the room before settling on Jessica. His brow furrowed in confusion. Where am I?" he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. Jessica swallowed hard, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You're in the hospital, sir. You collapsed outside and we brought you in for treatment." She paused, gathering her courage. "Can you tell me your full name?" The man's eyes darted away, a flicker of unease crossing his face. I'm not sure I should say," he mumbled. Jessica's heart sank, but she pressed on. "Please, it's important for your medical care. We need to know who you are." The man shifted uncomfortably in the bed. "Tom," he finally said. "My name's Tom Witter." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Tom, her father's name. She clenched her fists, willing herself to remain calm. "Do you have any family we can contact, Tom?" Tom's eyes clouded over, a mix of pain and regret flashing across his face. "No," he said quietly. "No family." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She struggled to keep her voice even as she asked, "Where are you from, Tom? Do you have a home?" Tom shook his head slowly. I've been on the streets for a long time. Can't remember the last time I had a real home. Jessica felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away furiously. Tom, she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Do you recognize me at all? Tom studied her face for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he shook his head. I'm sorry, miss. Should I? The weight of his words settled heavily on Jessica's shoulders. She stood up abruptly, needing to escape the suffocating emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I'll let the doctor know you're awake, she said quickly, turning away to hide the tears now freely flowing down her cheeks. The next morning, Jessica arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Her stomach churned with a mix of anxiety and anticipation as she made her way to Tom's room. She paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself before entering. Tom was awake, propped up against his pillows. He looked better than the day before, some color returning to his gaunt face. His eyes widened slightly as Jessica approached. Good morning, Tom, Jessica said, trying to keep her voice neutral. How are you feeling today? Better, thank you, Tom replied, his voice still weak but clearer than before. Jessica pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. Her heart raced as she gathered her courage. Tom, I need to ask you a few more questions, if that's all right. He nodded, a flicker of unease crossing his face. You mentioned yesterday that you don't have any family, Jessica began, her voice trembling slightly. Are you sure about that? Did you ever have a daughter? Tom's face paled and he looked away. After a long moment, he whispered, Yes, I had a daughter. A long time ago. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. What was her name? She asked, barely able to get the words out. Tom's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Jessica, he said softly. Her name was Jessica. The room seemed to spin around her as Jessica's suspicions were confirmed. This man, this frail, homeless stranger, was indeed her father. The father who had abandoned her and her mother so many years ago. Tom, she said, her voice shaking, do you recognize me now? Look at me, please. Slowly, Tom turned to face her. His eyes widened as he truly looked at her for the first time, recognition dawning on his weathered face. Jessica, he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and shame. Is it really you? Jessica nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, she said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. It's me. Jessica's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of her chair. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Her emotions, held in check for so long, finally burst forth like a dam breaking. Why? She demanded, her voice cracking. Why did you leave us? Tom flinched at her words, his eyes downcast. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His silence only fueled Jessica's anger. Do you have any idea what you did to us? Jessica's voice rose, years of pent-up hurt and rage pouring out. Mom struggled every day to make ends meet. I grew up wondering what I did wrong, why my own father didn't want me. Tears streamed down her face, but Jessica didn't bother to wipe them away. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths as she continued. We needed you, and you just disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. Nothing. Tom remained silent, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. His lack of response only intensified Jessica's fury. Say something, she shouted, her professional demeanor completely forgotten. Explain yourself. You owe us that much at least. The beeping of the heart monitor quickened, matching the frantic pace of Jessica's own heartbeat. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. All those years, she said, her voice now barely above a whisper. I dreamed of finding you, of getting answers. And now you're here, and you can't even look at me. Jessica paced the small room, reliving every painful memory of her childhood. The empty chair at her school plays, the loneliness on Father's Day, the whispers and pitying looks from neighbors. Each memory stoked the fire of her anger. "Do you know how hard it was?" she asked, her voice rising again. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up feeling unwanted, unloved by your own father?" Tom's lips quivered as he finally found his voice. "Jessica, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his words barely audible over the hum of hospital machinery. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Sorry? That's all you have to say after all these years?" Tom winced at the sharpness in her tone. He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I know it's not enough. Nothing I say could ever be enough." Jessica crossed her arms, her jaw clenched tight. She waited, her foot tapping impatiently on the linoleum floor. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and years of pain. Tom took a shaky breath. "I never wanted to leave you and your mother. You have to believe that." "Then why did you?" Jessica demanded, her voice rising. "What could possibly justify abandoning your family?" Tom's hands twisted in the thin hospital blanket. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, seeming to struggle with his words. Jessica's frustration grew with each passing second. "Tell me," she insisted, her patience wearing thin. "You owe us an explanation." Tom's shoulders slumped. "It's complicated," he mumbled. Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "Complicated? That's your excuse? We deserved better than that, Dad. We deserved the truth." Tom flinched at the word Dad, as if it caused him physical pain. He looked up at Jessica, his eyes pleading. "I want to explain, I do, but it's not easy to talk about." Jessica's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel her anger bubbling up again, threatening to spill over. "Try," she said through gritted teeth, "because I'm not leaving until I get some answers." The tension in the room was palpable as Tom struggled to find the right words. Jessica watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for the truth that had eluded her for so long. Tom took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he clutched the thin hospital blanket. "Jessica," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never wanted to leave you and your mother. It was the hardest decision I've ever had to make." Jessica's eyes narrowed, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. "Then why did you?" she demanded, her voice thick with emotion. Tom closed his eyes for a moment as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, they were filled with a mix of pain and determination. "I was wrongly implicated in a financial scam at work," he said softly. "It was big, really big. There were some dangerous people involved." Jessica's brow furrowed, confusion mixing with her anger. "What are you talking about?" "I stumbled upon some illegal activities at the company," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. "Before I could report it, they framed me, made it look like I was the one behind it all." Jessica's arms slowly uncrossed as she listened, her anger giving way to disbelief. "These people, they weren't just white-collar criminals," Tom explained, his eyes pleading for understanding. "They were dangerous, Jessica. They threatened you and your mother. They said if I didn't disappear, they'd hurt you both." Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. "But why didn't you tell us? We could have gone to the police." Tom shook his head sadly. "They had connections everywhere. I couldn't risk it. Staying away, it was the only way I could keep you safe." Tears began to form in Jessica's eyes as the weight of her father's words sank in. "All these years," she whispered, "we thought you just abandoned us." "I wanted to reach out so many times," Tom said, his own eyes glistening. "But I was afraid they might still be watching. I couldn't bear the thought of putting you in danger." Jessica sank into the chair beside the bed, her mind reeling from the revelation. The anger that had fueled her for so long began to crumble, replaced by a confusing mix of sadness and relief. Tom reached out a tentative hand towards his daughter. "I'm so sorry, Jessica. I never stopped loving you and your mother. Every day away from you was torture." Jessica sat in stunned silence, her mind racing to process the information Tom had just shared. The idea that her father had left to protect them seemed almost too incredible to believe. Yet the raw emotion in Tom's voice made her question the anger she had held onto for so long. She looked at the frail man before her, searching his face for any sign of deception. But all she saw was pain, regret, and a desperate hope for understanding. I don't know what to say," Jessica finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands twisted in her lap, a physical manifestation of her internal struggle. Tom nodded slowly, understanding etched across his weathered features. "I know it's a lot to take in, sweetheart. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I needed you to know the truth." Jessica felt tears welling up in her eyes. The hurt that had been her constant companion for years battled with a newfound empathy for her father's plight. She wanted to believe him, to embrace the idea that he hadn't simply abandoned them, but the pain of growing up without a father wasn't so easily erased. "All those birthdays," she said, her voice cracking. "All those times I needed you. Do you have any idea how much it hurt?" Tom's eyes filled with tears. "I thought about you every single day, Jessica. Every birthday, every Christmas. I imagined what you might look like, how you were doing in school. The pain of missing it all. It nearly broke me." Jessica felt her resolve weakening. The anger that had sustained her for so long began to give way to a confusing mix of emotions: sadness, relief, and a tentative hope. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly, meeting Tom's gaze. "But I think I want to try to understand." Tom nodded, a small, grateful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's more than I deserve, Jessica. Thank you." As they sat there in the quiet hospital room, Jessica felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay years of hurt and anger, while before her stretched the possibility of healing and reconciliation. The choice to take that first step towards forgiveness seemed both terrifying and necessary. Tom's eyes welled with tears as he looked at Jessica, his voice trembling with emotion. "Every single day I prayed," he said softly. "I begged God to guide me back to you and your mother. I asked him to keep you safe, to watch over you when I couldn't." Jessica listened, her heart torn between the hurt she'd carried for so long and the pain she now saw etched on her father's face. She remained silent, allowing Tom to continue. "Leaving you both was the hardest thing I've ever done," Tom confessed, his hands shaking as he spoke. "Every morning I woke up with regret gnawing at my heart. Every night I went to sleep wondering if you were okay, if you were happy." He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "But I was so afraid. Afraid that if I came back, I'd be putting you and your mother in danger. I couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to you because of me." Jessica could see the sorrow in her father's eyes, could hear the anguish in his voice. It was clear that his decision had weighed heavily on him all these years. Yet, despite the evident pain in Tom's words, Jessica found herself unable to fully let her guard down. She sat stiffly in her chair, her arms crossed over her chest as if to protect herself from the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. While a part of her yearned to believe her father, to embrace the explanation he offered, years of hurt and abandonment had built a wall around her heart that wasn't easily dismantled. "I understand you were scared," Jessica said carefully, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "But we were scared too. We needed you, and you weren't there." Tom nodded, accepting her words with a look of deep remorse. "I know, sweetheart. I know I can never make up for all the years I missed. But if you'll let me, I want to try to make things right." Jessica remained silent, her expression guarded as she processed her father's words. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but the wounds of the past still felt raw and tender. Jessica left her father's room, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She needed time to think, to process everything she'd just learned. As she walked down the hospital corridor, she spotted her friend and fellow nurse Maria at the nurses' station. "Maria, do you have a minute?" Jessica asked, her voice strained. Maria looked up, concern immediately crossing her face. Of course, Jess. What's wrong? Jessica pulled Maria into an empty break room and poured out the whole story. She told her about finding her long-lost father, his explanation for leaving, and the turmoil she now felt. As she spoke, tears welled up in her eyes, the weight of the situation finally hitting her. Maria listened patiently, her warm brown eyes filled with sympathy. When Jessica finished, Maria reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Oh, Jess," Maria said softly. "That's a lot to take in. How are you feeling?" Jessica shook her head, wiping away a stray tear. "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe him, but another part, I just can't forget all those years without him." Maria nodded understandingly. "I know it's hard, but have you considered forgiveness? It doesn't mean forgetting what happened, but it might help you heal." Jessica tensed at the word forgiveness. It seemed too big, too impossible right now. "I don't know if I can, Maria. Even if he was trying to protect us, he left us. We struggled so much without him." "I understand," Maria said gently. "But remember, forgiveness is as much for you as it is for him. It doesn't mean what he did was okay, but it might help you find peace." Jessica sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping. "I hear what you're saying, but it's just so hard to accept that his actions were justified. We needed him, and he wasn't there. How do I just forgive that?" Maria gave her a sympathetic smile. "It's not about justifying his actions, Jess. It's about letting go of the anger that's hurting you. Take your time. You don't have to decide anything right now." Jessica nodded, grateful for her friend's advice even if she wasn't ready to fully embrace it. The idea of forgiveness seemed daunting, almost impossible. But as she sat there with Maria, she knew she had a lot of soul-searching ahead of her. Jessica left the break room, her mind still reeling from her conversation with Maria. She found herself wandering to the hospital chapel, a small, quiet space where she often sought solace during difficult shifts. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the familiar scent of candles and old hymnals enveloped her. The chapel was empty, bathed in the soft glow of flickering candlelight. Jessica sank into a pew near the front, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her emotional burden. She stared at the simple wooden cross on the altar, her eyes filling with tears. "God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't understand. Why now? Why like this?" Jessica had always believed in God's plan. She'd clung to her faith through the hardest times, even when her father's abandonment left a gaping hole in her life. But now, faced with the reality of his return and his explanation, she felt her faith wavering. She closed her eyes trying to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, memories flooded her mind. Birthdays without her father, her mother's tired eyes as she worked multiple jobs, the empty chair at her high school graduation. The pain of those years felt as fresh as if they had happened yesterday. "How can I forgive him?" Jessica asked, her voice cracking. "He left us. We needed him and he wasn't there." She thought about what Maria had said about forgiveness being for her own healing. Jessica wanted to believe that, wanted to embrace the peace that forgiveness could bring. But every time she considered it, anger and hurt surged within her, threatening to overwhelm her. "I've always tried to follow your teachings," Jessica continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But this is asking too much. How can I forgive years of abandonment?" As she sat there, wrestling with her faith and her feelings, Jessica felt torn between the Christian ideals she'd always upheld and the very human pain that gripped her heart. The idea of forgiving her father seemed impossible, a mountain too high to climb. Yet a small voice in the back of her mind whispered of healing, of the possibility of a relationship restored. It was this tiny glimmer of hope that scared Jessica the most. To hope meant opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again. Jessica took a deep breath, steeling herself as she approached Tom's hospital room. Her hand hesitated on the door handle, her heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and determination. She reminded herself that this was necessary, not just for her own healing, but to understand the man who had been absent from her life for so long. As she entered, Tom looked up from his bed, surprise and hope flickering across his weathered face. "Jessica," he said softly, his voice tinged with both joy and uncertainty. "Hi," Jessica replied, her tone guarded but not unkind. She settled into the chair beside his bed, her posture stiff. "I thought maybe we could talk some more." Tom nodded eagerly, though his eyes betrayed his nervousness. "I'd like that very much." Over the next hour, Jessica listened as Tom haltingly shared stories of his life on the streets. He spoke of cold nights huddled in doorways, of the constant hunger that gnawed at his stomach, and of the crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion. "I never stopped thinking about you and your mother," Tom admitted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Every birthday, every Christmas, I wondered what you were doing, how you were growing up." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to hold on to her anger, but hearing the pain in her father's voice made it difficult. "Why didn't you ever try to contact us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom hung his head. "I was ashamed and afraid. I thought you'd be better off without me in your lives." As Tom continued to share his experiences, Jessica found herself leaning in, her initial reluctance giving way to a growing sense of empathy. She saw the toll that years of hardship had taken on him, not just physically but emotionally as well. When Tom described a particularly harrowing winter night when he'd nearly frozen to death, Jessica felt tears prick at her eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Tom looked at her, surprise and gratitude mingling in his expression. In that moment, Jessica realized that her anger was slowly being replaced by something else, a complicated mix of sadness, understanding, and the faintest glimmer of hope. While she wasn't ready to forgive him completely, she felt the first cracks appearing in the wall she'd built around her heart. That night, Jessica stood outside her home, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The weight of her father's revelation pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew it was time to share this life-changing news with her mother, Lydia. As Jessica stepped inside, the familiar scent of her mother's lavender candles enveloped her. Lydia emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face lit up at the sight of her daughter, but quickly turned to concern when she saw Jessica's troubled expression. "Honey, what's wrong?" Lydia asked, her brow furrowing with worry. Jessica took a deep breath. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we sit down?" They settled on the worn floral couch in the living room, the same one they'd sat on countless times before, sharing joys and sorrows. Jessica's heart raced as she gathered the courage to speak. "Mom," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I found Dad." Lydia's face paled, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What do you mean you found him?" Jessica recounted the events at the hospital, explaining how she had discovered Tom and learned about his reasons for leaving. As she spoke, Lydia's expression hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line. When Jessica finished, silence hung heavy in the air. Lydia stood up abruptly, pacing the room with agitation. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "No, Jessica, that man doesn't deserve our forgiveness. Not after what he did to us." "But Mom," Jessica pleaded, "he says he left to protect us. He was trying to keep us safe." Lydia whirled around, her eyes flashing with anger and hurt. "Protect us? By abandoning us? By leaving us to struggle alone for years? No, Jessica, that's not protection. That's cowardice." Jessica felt torn, caught between her mother's pain and her father's remorse. She understood her mother's anger. She had felt it too. But she also couldn't forget the broken man in the hospital bed, filled with regret and longing for his family. "I'm not saying we should forgive him right away," Jessica said softly. "But maybe we could give him a chance to explain." Lydia's face softened slightly at her daughter's words, but the hurt in her eyes remained. "I don't know if I can do that, Jessica. He hurt us so deeply. How can we ever trust him again?" Jessica felt the weight of her parents' pain pressing down on her. She was caught in the middle, understanding both sides but unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. As she looked at her mother's anguished face, She realized that healing their broken family would be far more challenging than she had imagined. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. She reached out and gently took her mother's hand. "Mom, please listen. Dad told me he was wrongly accused of being involved in a financial scam. He left to protect us from dangerous people who might have come after us." Lydia pulled her hand away, her eyes flashing with anger. "Protect us? By vanishing without a word? Do you have any idea how much we suffered, Jessica? How many nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering what I did wrong?" "I know, Mom, I was there too, remember?" Jessica's voice cracked with emotion. "But what if he's telling the truth? What if he really thought he was doing the right thing?" Lydia shook her head vehemently. "No, Jessica, there's no excuse for what he did. He abandoned us. He left us to struggle alone for years. How can you even consider forgiving him?" Jessica felt torn between her mother's pain and her father's remorse. "I'm not saying we should forgive him right away, but maybe we could at least hear him out? Give him a chance to explain face to face?" "Absolutely not," Lydia snapped. Her voice was filled with bitterness that had been festering for years. "I don't want to see him or hear his excuses. He made his choice all those years ago. He chose to leave us behind." Jessica tried once more. "But Mom, he's been living on the streets. He's suffered too. Doesn't that count for anything?" Lydia's face hardened. "That was his choice, Jessica. We suffered too, but we didn't run away. We faced our problems head on. I won't let him waltz back into our lives now and pretend nothing happened." Jessica felt frustration building inside her. She wanted so badly for her mother to understand, to at least consider the possibility that there was more to the story. But Lydia's pain and anger were like an impenetrable wall. "I can't believe you're even considering this," Lydia said, her voice low and hurt. "After everything we've been through." Jessica sighed, realizing that this conversation wasn't going anywhere. The gap between her parents seemed wider than ever, and she felt helplessly caught in the middle. Despite her mother's reaction, Jessica found herself drawn back to the hospital, visiting Tom day after day. Each time she entered his room, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, curiosity, and a growing sense of empathy she couldn't quite explain. On one visit, she found Tom sitting up in bed, his eyes distant and filled with sorrow. "I thought about you and your mother every single day," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica sat down beside him, her heart conflicted. "Then why didn't you come back?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Tom turned to her, his eyes brimming with tears. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared that coming back would put you in danger. Scared that you'd hate me for leaving. And then, as the years went by, I was ashamed. How could I face you after being gone for so long?" As Jessica listened, she began to see beyond the label of the man who left. She saw a person broken by circumstances and his own choices, carrying a weight of regret that had bent him almost to breaking. Over the next few visits, Tom shared more about his life on the streets. He told her about cold nights huddled in doorways, about the hunger that gnawed at him constantly, and about the moments of kindness from strangers that kept him going. "I never stopped loving you, Jessica," he said one afternoon, his voice cracking with emotion. "Every time I saw a little girl with her father, I thought of you. I wondered what you looked like, if you were happy, if you ever thought about me." Jessica felt her anger slowly giving way to a deep, aching sadness. She began to see Tom not just as her father, but as a human being who had made a terrible mistake and paid for it dearly. One day as she was leaving, Tom called out to her, "Jessica, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all the pain I've caused you and your mother." Jessica paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She turned back to look at Tom, seeing for the first time the full extent of his brokenness and remorse. In that moment, she realized that forgiveness might be possible, not just for Tom, but for her own healing too. After days of gentle persuasion from Jessica, Lydia finally agreed to meet Tom at the hospital. Her jaw was set tight as she walked down the sterile hallway, her eyes burning with years of pent-up anger and hurt. As they entered Tom's room, the air grew thick with tension. Lydia's gaze fell upon the frail man in the hospital bed, barely recognizing the husband who had left her so many years ago. "How dare you?" Lydia hissed, her voice trembling with emotion. "How dare you show your face after all this time?" Tom flinched at her words, his eyes filled with sorrow and regret. "Lydia, No." Lydia cut him off, her voice rising. "You don't get to speak. Do you have any idea what you put us through? The nights I spent wondering if you were dead or alive? The birthdays and holidays Jessica celebrated without her father?" Tears streamed down Lydia's face as she unleashed years of pain and anger. "I had to work 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. I had to be both mother and father to our daughter. And where were you?" Tom's shoulders shook as he began to sob. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "I never wanted to leave you. I thought I was protecting you both." "Protecting us?" Lydia scoffed. "From what?" Through his tears, Tom began to explain. He told her about the financial scam, the threats, and the impossible choice he felt he had to make. As he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion and regret. "I was scared," Tom admitted, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I thought if I stayed away, you and Jessica would be safe. But every day without you was agony. I've carried this guilt for so long." Lydia listened, her anger slowly giving way to confusion and a hint of empathy. She saw the toll the years had taken on Tom, the genuine remorse in his eyes. For the first time, she began to see the truth behind his decision, the fear that had driven him away from the family he loved. As Lydia left the hospital, her emotions were in turmoil. The anger that had sustained her for so many years still burned, but now it was mixed with confusion and a hint of something she didn't want to name: compassion. She drove home in silence, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The familiar streets of her neighborhood offered no comfort as her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Once home, Lydia sank into her favorite armchair, feeling drained. She glanced at the family photos on the mantel, her eyes lingering on a picture of her and Tom on their wedding day. They looked so young, so full of hope and love. Where had it all gone wrong? With a heavy sigh, Lydia closed her eyes and began to pray. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't know what to do. I'm so angry, but I saw him today. I saw the man I married in those eyes." Tears began to fall as she continued her prayer. "How can I forgive him? He left us. He left me to raise our daughter alone. But he thought he was protecting us. Was he right? Was I wrong all these years?" Lydia's chest heaved with sobs as years of pent-up emotion poured out. She prayed for guidance, for understanding, for the strength to do what was right, whatever that might be. As her tears subsided, Lydia found herself reflecting on her own life. She thought about the times she had needed forgiveness, the mistakes she had made. She remembered the relief and gratitude she felt when others had shown her mercy. "Is that what you want from me, Lord?" she asked softly. "To forgive as I have been forgiven?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Lydia knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, if at all. The hurt was deep, the wounds still raw despite the passage of time. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility. Jessica sat with her mother at their kitchen table, holding Lydia's hands in her own. "Mom," she said gently, "I know this is hard, but maybe we could try to hear Dad out one more time." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can, Jessica. The pain, it's still so raw." Jessica squeezed her mother's hands. "I know, Mom. I felt it too. But seeing Dad, hearing his story, it changed something in me. Maybe it could for you too?" Lydia looked at her daughter, seeing the hope in her eyes. She took a deep breath. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try. For you." A few days later, they met Tom in a quiet corner of the hospital garden. The air was thick with tension, but unlike their first encounter, there was no shouting, no accusations. Tom looked at Lydia, his eyes filled with remorse. "Lydia, he began, his voice shaking. "I know I hurt you. I hurt both of you so deeply. There aren't enough words to express how sorry I am." Lydia remained silent, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, but she didn't look away. Tom continued, his words coming faster now. "Every day I was away, I thought of you both. Every single day. The love I felt for you and Jessica, it never stopped. It was the only thing that kept me going sometimes." Tears began to roll down his weathered cheeks. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've regretted it every moment since." Lydia's composure began to crack. Her lip trembled as she listened to Tom pour out his heart. "I understand if you can't forgive me," Thomas said softly, "but I need you to know that my love for you and Jessica never wavered. You were my reason for surviving, for hoping that one day, somehow, I might find my way back to you." Lydia's tears fell freely now. She looked at Tom, really looked at him, and saw the man she had loved all those years ago. The pain was still there, but something else was growing alongside it: understanding. As the days turned into weeks, Tom's health slowly improved. The family's journey toward healing was a delicate one, filled with small steps and quiet moments of connection. One Sunday morning, Jessica suggested they attend church together. "It might help us find some peace," she said softly, looking at both her parents. Lydia hesitated, but Tom nodded eagerly. "I'd like that," he said, his voice filled with hope. The following Sunday, the three of them walked into the small community church. Jessica felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation as they found seats in a pew near the back. Tom sat between his daughter and Lydia, his hands trembling slightly. As the service began, the familiar hymns washed over them. Jessica noticed her mother's lips moving silently to the words she knew by heart. Tom closed his eyes, letting the music soothe his weary soul. During the sermon, the pastor spoke about forgiveness and second chances. Jessica couldn't help but feel it was meant for them. She glanced at her parents, seeing the emotions play across their faces. After the service, they lingered in the church garden. The spring air was crisp and full of promise. Tom turned to Lydia, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me this chance." Lydia's expression softened. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and squeezed Tom's hand briefly before letting go. As the weeks passed, church became a regular part of their routine. It provided a neutral ground where they could come together, finding comfort in shared faith and community. The wounds of the past were still present, raw and tender at times. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to heal. Conversations became easier, silences less strained. They found themselves sharing memories, both good and painful, as they worked to rebuild their fractured family. One evening, as they sat together after a simple family dinner, Jessica looked at her parents. She saw the lines of age and hardship on their faces, but also a glimmer of the love that had once bound them together. The road ahead was still long, but Jessica felt a surge of hope. They were taking this journey together, one step at a time, guided by faith and the power of forgiveness. Jessica sat alone in her room, her mind swirling with thoughts of the past few weeks. The soft glow of her bedside lamp cast shadows on the wall as she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She hadn't realized how much anger she'd been carrying until now, when it finally began to lift from her shoulders. She thought back to the day she found her father, Tom, outside the hospital. The fury that had consumed her then seemed so distant now. Jessica opened her eyes and reached for her well-worn Bible on the nightstand. As she flipped through the pages, she remembered the countless nights she'd spent praying for answers, for peace, for anything to fill the void her father's absence had left. "God," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "I think I'm finally starting to understand." Jessica's fingers traced the familiar words about forgiveness. She'd read them so many times before, but now they resonated differently. She realized that her anger, justified as it may have been, had become a heavy burden. It had colored her relationships, her work, her very outlook on life. With a sigh, Jessica closed the Bible and clasped her hands together. She began to pray, not just with words, but with her whole heart. As she did, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. "I choose forgiveness," she said aloud, her voice growing stronger, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Tears began to fall as Jessica acknowledged the pain she'd been holding onto for so long. But with each tear, she felt lighter. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness wasn't a one-time decision, but a daily choice. Yet for the first time in years, Jessica felt truly hopeful. As she wiped her eyes, Jessica glanced at a family photo on her dresser. It was taken just last week, her, Tom, and Lydia, all together. They weren't smiling widely, but there was a cautious hope in their eyes. Jessica realized that by choosing forgiveness, she wasn't just freeing her father from the past, she was freeing herself too. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the living room window, Lydia stood nervously by the front door. Her heart raced as she heard footsteps approaching. With a deep breath, she opened the door to find Tom standing there, looking just as anxious as she felt. "Come in," Lydia said softly, stepping aside to let him enter. Tom walked in slowly, his eyes taking in the familiar surroundings of the home he'd left behind so many years ago. The air was thick with tension and unspoken words. Lydia led him to the couch where they both sat, a careful distance between them. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air. "Tom," Lydia began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking and praying, and I think I'm ready to forgive you." Tom's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and hope flickering across his face. "Lydia, She held up a hand, stopping him. "Please, let me finish. What you did, it hurt us so deeply. There were nights I didn't think I'd make it through, raising Jessica alone, wondering why you left us." Tears welled up in Lydia's eyes as she continued. "But I understand now why you did it. And while it doesn't erase the pain, I can see how much you've suffered too." Tom listened intently, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. As Lydia spoke, he could see the years of hurt etched on her face, but also a glimmer of something else: hope. "I want to move forward," Lydia said, her voice growing stronger. "I want to give you the chance to be part of our lives again. It won't be easy, and there's a lot of lost time to make up for, but I'm willing to try if you are." At these words, Tom couldn't hold back any longer. He reached out, gently taking Lydia's hands in his own. "Lydia, I can't tell you how much this means to me. I've dreamed of this moment for so long, but I never thought it would actually happen." Overwhelmed with emotion, they both stood up. For a moment, they hesitated, years of distance between them. Then, slowly, they moved towards each other. As they embraced, it was as if a dam broke. Tears flowed freely as they held each other tightly, years of hurt and regret melting away in the warmth of forgiveness. As the weeks passed, the Witter family began to weave new threads into the tapestry of their lives. Tom, Lydia, and Jessica took small but meaningful steps towards rebuilding their relationship, creating fresh memories to cherish. One sunny Sunday morning, they found themselves walking together to the local church. Jessica couldn't help but smile as she watched her parents, hand in hand, their faces alight with a joy she hadn't seen in years. The simple act of attending service as a family filled her heart with warmth. "I never thought I'd see this day," Jessica whispered to herself, her eyes misty with emotion. After the service, they decided to have lunch at a nearby diner. As they sat in a cozy booth, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in weeks. They laughed over shared plates of comfort food, swapping stories and catching up on lost time. "Remember when Jessica used to insist on wearing her fairy wings to school?" Lydia chuckled, her eyes twinkling with mirth. Tom grinned, leaning in. "Oh, I'd almost forgotten about that. She was quite the stubborn little princess, wasn't she?" Jessica blushed but couldn't help joining in the laughter. It felt good to reminisce, to see her parents bonding over shared memories of her childhood. As the days turned into weeks, family dinners became a regular occurrence. The kitchen, once a place of solitary meals and quiet contemplation, now buzzed with life and laughter. Tom proved to be an unexpectedly good cook, and soon the aroma of his famous pot roast filled the house every Sunday evening. One particularly memorable night, as they sat around the dinner table, Tom raised his glass. "I just want to say, thank you for giving me this second chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I promise to cherish every moment we have together." Lydia reached out, squeezing his hand. "We're all getting a second chance, Tom, and I'm grateful for it." Jessica looked at her parents, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. The road ahead might not be perfect, but they were facing it together as a family. One warm afternoon, Jessica sat on her favorite bench in the hospital's garden, her eyes closed as she basked in the warm sunlight. The gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers, reminding her of new beginnings. As she reflected on the incredible journey her family had been through, a sense of peace washed over her. Opening her eyes, Jessica gazed at the clear blue sky above. She couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in such a short time. The anger and hurt that had once consumed her heart had given way to forgiveness and love. She knew without a doubt that this transformation wouldn't have been possible without her faith. "Thank you, God," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Jessica thought back to the darkest moments of her struggle, when she had felt lost and alone. It was during those times that she had clung to her faith, finding comfort in prayer and the belief that God had a plan for her family. Now, as she watched her parents rediscover their love for each other, she realized just how powerful that faith had been. Tears welled up in her eyes as she remembered the first time they had attended church together as a reunited family. The way her father's voice had cracked with emotion as they sang hymns, the gentle squeeze of her mother's hand during prayer. These moments had touched her soul in ways she couldn't explain. Jessica pulled out her worn Bible from her bag, running her fingers over its familiar leather cover. She flipped to a passage that had become her anchor throughout this journey. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Romans 8:28. As she read the words, Jessica felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her faith had not only guided her towards forgiveness, but it also strengthened her family's bond. She realized that without her belief in God's guidance, she might never have found the courage to reconnect with her father or help her mother heal. With each passing day, Jessica could see the positive changes in her family. The tension that had once filled their interactions was replaced by genuine warmth and understanding. They were learning to communicate openly, to share their fears and hopes, and to support each other through the ongoing healing process. With Jessica's unwavering support, Tom began to take small but significant steps towards rebuilding his life. The journey wasn't easy, but his determination to make amends and be there for his family fueled his efforts. One sunny morning, Jessica helped Tom prepare for a job interview at a local hardware store. She carefully ironed his shirt, making sure he looked presentable. As she smoothed out the wrinkles, she couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and nervousness for her father. "You've got this, Dad," Jessica said, straightening his collar. "Just be yourself." Tom nodded, his eyes misty with gratitude. "Thank you, sweetheart. I don't know where I'd be without you." The interview went better than expected, and Tom returned home with a spring in his step. When he shared the good news that he'd been offered the job, Jessica couldn't contain her excitement. She threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. "We need to celebrate," she exclaimed, her face beaming with joy. That evening, the family gathered for a small dinner party. Lydia prepared Tom's favorite meal, and Jessica baked a cake with congratulations written in wobbly frosting. As they sat around the table, sharing food and laughter, the warmth of family love filled the room. Tom looked around at the faces of his wife and daughter, his heart swelling with emotion. "I can't thank you both enough for giving me this second chance," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I promise I'll do everything I can to make you proud." Lydia reached out and squeezed his hand. "We're already proud of you, Tom. You're trying, and that's what matters." As the weeks passed, Tom threw himself into his new job. He came home each day with stories about the customers he'd helped or the new skills he'd learned. Jessica and Lydia listened eagerly, celebrating each small victory with him. One payday, Tom surprised them by bringing home a bouquet of flowers for Lydia and a small potted plant for Jessica. "It's not much," he said sheepishly, "but I wanted to do something special with my first real paycheck in years." Jessica's eyes welled up as she accepted the plant. It was a simple gesture, but it symbolized so much more. It represented hope, growth, and the healing that was taking place within their family. As summer turned to autumn, the Witter family planned a special gathering to celebrate their journey of healing and reconciliation. Jessica, Lydia, and Tom decided to host a small dinner party at Jessica's cozy apartment, inviting a few close friends and family members who had supported them through their difficult times. The evening of the gathering arrived, and the apartment was filled with the warm aroma of home-cooked food and the gentle sound of laughter. As their guests mingled and chatted, Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder at how far they had come. When it was time for dinner, everyone gathered around the table. Before they began eating, Tom cleared his throat and spoke softly. "If you don't mind, I'd like to say a few words and offer a prayer of thanks." The room fell silent as Tom continued, his voice filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd be here, surrounded by the people I love most in this world. God has blessed us with a second chance, and I'm grateful beyond words." Jessica reached out and took her father's hand, and Lydia did the same on his other side. Soon, everyone around the table joined hands, forming a circle of love and support. Tom bowed his head and began to pray. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for your infinite mercy and love. You've brought our family back together and healed wounds we thought would never mend. We're grateful for the second chance you've given us and for the strength to forgive and love one another." As Tom prayed, Jessica felt tears welling up in her eyes. She squeezed her father's hand tightly, overwhelmed by the love she felt for her family and the gratitude in her heart. "Lord," Tom continued, his voice thick with emotion, "we ask for your continued guidance as we move forward. Help us to cherish each moment we have together and to always remember the power of forgiveness and faith. In Jesus' name, we pray. Amen." "Amen," the group echoed softly. As they raised their heads, Jessica looked around the table. She saw the love in her mother's eyes, the peace on her father's face, and the warmth radiating from their friends and family. In that moment, she knew that while the scars of the past might never fully fade, the bond they now shared was stronger than ever before. As the dinner party wound down, Jessica found herself standing by the window, looking out at the twinkling city lights. The soft murmur of conversation behind her filled her with a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. Tom approached her, his steps slow but steady. "Penny for your thoughts, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Jessica turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, Dad. It's almost hard to believe." Tom nodded, his own eyes misty. "I know what you mean. There were so many nights I dreamed of this, but never thought it would happen." As they stood there, Lydia joined them, wrapping an arm around each of their waists. The three of them gazed out at the city, a living picture of reconciliation and healing. Jessica felt a warmth spread through her chest. She realized that the anger and hurt that had once consumed her had been replaced by something far more powerful: love, forgiveness, and an unshakable faith. "You know," Jessica said softly, "I used to think that some things were just too broken to fix. But now I see that with God's help, anything is possible." Lydia squeezed her daughter's hand. "That's right, honey. Faith can move mountains, and it can certainly mend hearts." Tom nodded in agreement. "And forgiveness. It's not just about letting go of the past. It's about making room for a better future." As they stood there embracing each other, Jessica felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. She knew that their journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges to face and wounds to heal. But she also knew that they would face whatever came their way together with love and faith as their guide. The night had grown late, and their guests began to say their goodbyes. As Jessica hugged each person, she saw in their eyes the same hope and joy that she felt in her heart. They had witnessed a miracle of sorts, a family reborn through the power of forgiveness and faith. If you enjoyed the story of Tom and Jessica, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.